I don't know if you can see me. Can people see me? Oh, there's Yaa Gyasi. I'd rather you see her. Anyway, hi, I'm Andrea Dupree. I'm the program director at Lighthouse, which has been in Denver. It's a literary center in Denver since 1997, recently repurposed to be the virtual center for everyone, everywhere. We are so glad you're joining us tonight for this Lit Fest, Storyfest prologue. We had envisioned having a festival of all the narrative arts, from music to dance to literature to film, visual art, everything. We had envisioned that we would be launching that this month and featuring many of the wonderful storytellers that you will be meeting in these prologues, even though I was always told never write a prologue. Yaa didn't write a prologue, I noticed, for her latest novel. So we will be kind of meeting out some of these little teasers and hopefully launching, probably not next fall, but the fall after, with our Storyfest as it was originally imagined. But I invite you now to imagine that we're all enjoying like good food and music and clean air out here in Denver, with a bunch of people who are safe to be around. I wanted to let you know that we have closed captioning. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there is closed captioning that you can, I know not everybody can hear if they're hoping for closed captioning, but there is closed captioning at the bottom of the screen that you can activate. We would like to thank the SCFD, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Bonfils Stanton Foundation, and Colorado Creative Industries for helping us make these virtual Storyfest prologues possible. And of course, all of you on the other side of this Zoom. I also want to thank our book selling partners at BookBar, and we are going to, oh, the music is still on. Are people hearing music? No. Our book selling partners at BookBar have a link that you can click on, order books from Khadijah and Yaa, and put in the comments section that you are hoping to get the signed copies, which you just write Storyfest under comments, and that will get you that. You are not on camera or on mic right now, but you can submit questions at the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and Khadijah is going to get to those after a bit. We're first going to hear Yaa Gyasi read from her new book, and then Yaa and Khadijah will be in conversation, which I'm personally looking so forward to. So I'm going to introduce our two panelists, and then we'll get Yaa on to read her first chapter. I highly, highly encourage you to go run, don't walk. Oops, you can't see him. Oh, well, because of my virtual background. Oh, yay, she's got it. Run, don't walk to get Transcendent Kingdom. Also get Homegoing. They're both so amazing. And then we also have Khadijah's Anodyne signed copies at BookBar. I also love all of her work, so read any of it. So I'm going to introduce Yaa first. Yaa Gyasi was born in Ghana and raised in Huntsville, Alabama. She holds a BA in English from Stanford University and an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop, where she held a Dean's Graduate Research Fellowship. Her debut novel, Homegoing, won her the National Book Critics Circle John Leonard Award for Best First Book, the Penn Hemingway Award for First Book of Fiction, and the National Book Foundation's 5 Under 35 honors for 2016, as well as the American Book Award, which makes us love her all the more and not feel at all jealous. And Transcendent Kingdom came out last month to rave reviews. I read it. It's wonderful. I highly recommend it. And Khadijah Queen is the author of 6 books, including Anodyne, out from Tin House last month. Previous books include the critically acclaimed I'm So Fine, a list of famous men and what I had on, which you have to read, as well as Anodyne. You just absolutely have to. And she also wrote Conduit, Black Peculiar, and Fearful Beloved. You should also read all of those. And her verse play, Non Sequitur, won the Leslie Scalapino Award for Innovative Women's Performance Writing. Her poetry and prose have appeared in Harper's, the Georgia Review, Fence, American Poetry Review, and elsewhere. She co-edited a feature on poetry and disability for the New York Times. She's an assistant professor of creative writing at the University of Colorado Boulder and serves as core faculty for the Mile High MFA in creative writing at Regis University, as well as a favorite instructor at Lighthouse. So welcome to both of you, and we're going to turn it over to Yaa to start things off.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you to Lighthouse for hosting. Thank you to Khadijah for moderating. I'm so excited for this conversation. And thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. I know, we're all trying to figure out how to spend our time these days. And so I'm always really thankful when people spend a little bit of it with me. So thanks for showing up. I'm just going to read from the very first chapter, and then we can get right to it. Whenever I think of my mother, I picture a queen-sized bed with her lying in it, a practiced stillness filling the room. For months on end, she colonized that bed like a virus, the first time when I was a child, and then again when I was a graduate student. The first time, I was sent to Ghana to wait her out. While there, I was walking through Khadijah Market with my aunt when she grabbed my arm and pointed. "Look, a crazy person," she said in Twi. "Do you see? A crazy person." I was mortified. My aunt was speaking so loudly, and the man, tall with dust caked into his dreadlocks, was within earshot. I see, I answered in a low hiss. The man continued past us, mumbling to himself as he waved his hands about in gestures that only he could understand. My aunt nodded, satisfied, and we kept walking past the hordes of people gathered in that agoraphobia-inducing market until we reached the stall where we would spend the rest of the morning attempting to sell knockoff handbags. In my 3 months there, we sold only 4 bags. Even now, I don't completely understand why my aunt singled the man out to me. Maybe she thought there were no crazy people in America, that I had never seen one before. Or maybe she was thinking about my mother, about the real reason I was stuck in Ghana that summer, sweating in a stall with an aunt I hardly knew while my mother healed at home in Alabama. I was 11, and I could see that my mother wasn't sick, not in the ways that I was used to. I didn't understand what my mother needed healing from. I didn't understand, but I did. And my embarrassment at my aunt's loud gesture had as much to do with my understanding as it did with the man who had passed us by. My aunt was saying, that is what crazy looks like. But instead, what I heard was my mother's name. What I saw was my mother's face, still as lake water, the pastor's hand resting gently on her forehead, his prayer a light hum that made the room buzz. I'm not sure I know what crazy looks like, but even today, when I hear the word, I picture a split screen. The dreadlocked man in Khadijah on one side, my mother lying in bed on the other. I think about how no one at all reacted to that man in the market, not in fear or disgust, nothing, save my aunt who wanted me to look. He was, it seemed to me, at perfect peace, even as he gesticulated wildly, even as he mumbled. But my mother, in her bed, infinitely still, was wild inside. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yaa. It's such a pleasure to be here to talk with you. And I have like all these questions, but then as you were reading, I came up with another one. Like I can't help myself. So it's not formulated properly, but let's see if I can talk myself through it because I feel like it's important. But I will say, like, I will start like with large questions and then try to zero in on things without giving anything away. And I did focus more on process because I'm a process nerd. But if at any time you feel like you want to talk more about content, feel free to steer things another way. But this question that came upon me as you were reading, I just want to acknowledge like the weight of external forces in this book. There is a really strong sense that things that the characters cannot help shape their lives in really important and inescapable ways. And there's not an easy reconciliation between their interior lives and those exterior circumstances, but there's a struggle to come to sort of an acceptance of it. So I wondered if you wanted to talk about that, if you thought about that as you were writing, and if you want to talk about that in terms of the, I don't want to call it a struggle between science and faith, but the development of Gifty's thinking about science and faith when it comes to those circumstances we can't control.
Yes, absolutely. I think that that theme is kind of my project writ large. Like that's the thing that I'm most interested in my writing, both with Transcendent Kingdom and with Homegoing. Part of what I'm interested in thinking through is all of this stuff that we inherit that we don't really have control over, all of the, as you put it, external forces that are acting upon our lives, directing our lives, despite what we might want, despite what we maybe are aware of, and how we try to make sense of a life in which senseless things happen that are beyond our control. And in Homegoing, you know, this was kind of very macro, done on a very macro level. Transcendent Kingdom is really intimate. You see it far more on a personal level as these family members interact with one another. But it's something that I'm really interested in, the way that trauma kind of shapes us, how it moves within families, how it directs our lives and our steps. And so I think this book started not with that kind of a broad idea. It started mostly with me trying to think about a woman who grew up in the church, who grew up with this deep faith, who then turns away from that faith and toward a career in science, but who has to kind of remember or draw from those early childhood experiences in order to have a language with which to relate to her mother, who is still incredibly devout. So it's about kind of the loss of that language and the reclamation of that language in order to love someone or show your love for someone who speaks this particular language. The science aspect, I think, kind of came in an almost roundabout way. And we could talk about this more later if you have other questions about it. But my friend from childhood from Alabama is a neuroscientist. And I really just kind of wanted to get to know her work a little bit more. And I think through fiction. And so part of this book was about like trying to understand what she did for a living. So her work is in addiction and depression, was in addiction and depression. And so it almost felt like a writer's prompt of a novel, like write a book about a woman who studies addiction and depression. And obviously there are like a million ways that you could take that, but I decided to have a woman who is affected by these two things at the center has personal experience with it and is trying to write in a way, work rather, in a way that is at a remove from that personal experience.
She does try, but she can't quite,
No,
you know?
she
And you
can't.
were talking about how to love another person, but she's also struggling with how to love herself in
Yeah.
a place that doesn't show her any, really. And then when folks do try to show that to her, she doesn't know how to receive it.
Yeah.
And well, okay, I have a lot of questions about that, but one I can think of that's a larger question is this question of place and like the grief and trauma of a place. We often talk about it as an emotion, but it seems very much associated with place for gifties. And it's also, you know, a thread in homegoing. We think about home or as a culture, American culture, we tend to think about home as a place you want to return to. That's a place of comfort, but it feels very much denied in both of these works. So I wonder if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I'm hugely interested in how place informs character, certainly when I'm writing, but just more broadly, how place informs who we are as people. And I think part of my fascination with this is because I myself immigrated to America quite young. I came when I was 2, and then my family moved around a lot. We lived in Ohio and then Illinois, Tennessee, and Alabama. And we got to Alabama when I was 9. And the experience of each of these places was so like starkly different from one another, that I would spend so many hours of my time doing these little thought experiments where I'd say, you know, if we'd stayed in Columbus, I'd be this person. If we stayed in Tennessee, I'd be this person. Like I was so keenly aware of the fact that so much of our politics, so much of our faith, so much of our understanding of community, so much of our understanding of like how to be kind to one another comes from the people around us, from the places that we grow up in. And so I think in Transcendent Kingdom, Gifty is a character who is so very defined by her isolation. She's the only one in her family who didn't have this connection to Ghana, who wasn't born there. She's born in the States, and she doesn't go until she is 11. From that passage that I read at the beginning there, that's when she's in Ghana. It's her first time in Ghana, and she's going under these really traumatic circumstances. Her mother has sent her there so that she can recuperate from her depression alone. And it's after, I don't think it's a spoiler to say this, it's after her brother's passing. And so Ghana becomes kind of this site of its own kind of trauma. She's trying to, she doesn't want to be there. And she knows that she's only there because all of these horrible things have happened in her life. So she doesn't have a particularly strong relationship to Ghana, but she also has a kind of fraught relationship to Alabama, to the place that she grows up in, mostly because her parents have decided, for whatever reason, the reasons aren't ever made explicitly clear, but her parents have decided to live in the predominantly white part of Huntsville and to attend a predominantly white church. And I think so much of this book is seeing what the impact of that isolation, that particular isolation of being within this faith community that has that doesn't see you as part of the larger community, what that does. Gifty calls it at one point a spiritual wound, and I think this book is like trying to find and address that spiritual wound.
I would agree with that. And I think this might be a good place to bring up that Hopkins epigraph and then that little part in the book about Hopkins. Obviously, I'm a poet, I'm gonna pick up on the outcast, exuberant poet of faith, because there is a certain reflection of him in Gifty herself, right?
Yeah.
She has this exuberance that keeps getting, you know, tamped down by environment. And I found myself as a reader kind of grieving that as well. But my question for you as the writer is how you think about poetry in your writing practice, or do you think about poetry in your writing practice? And if so, how did you arrive at that?
Yeah, I do think about poetry. I love poetry. I spent some very misguided years in college thinking that I was going to be a poet. But my poetry was just never as good as my fiction, so I kind of abandoned it. Um, though I didn't completely abandon it because I keep reading it obsessively. And one of my first loves in poetry was Hopkins. I took a class in college called, it was just Wordsworth and Hopkins, and it felt like, you know, we had these two factions in the class, like the people who were drawn to Wordsworth and the people who were drawn to Hopkins. And I feel like the people who were drawn to Hopkins were very strange. I was one of them. But what I loved about him, I loved what you called the exuberance of Hopkins, because I think he's an incredibly exuberant writer, really interested in the way that language is like formed on the tongue, you know. I'm thinking of like Duns Scotus's Oxford, where he has those lines like cuckoo echoing, rick racked, river rounded. Like he wants you to like taste these words. But also, I think the thing that I loved about Hopkins that I really connected with was just his like kind of tortured religiosity. He felt like his poetry was not holy. He burned so much of his work. And his journals are so tortured, like him wondering if you know, the life that he was trying to lead was a holy life, was a righteous life. And an early origin story for Transcendent Kingdom is that after I finished Homegoing, I set it aside. This is after I finished a first draft of Homegoing. I set it aside and I wrote this short story about a woman who was a Gerard Manley Hopkins scholar whose mother comes to stay with her. And so it was a woman who was thinking about Hopkins's work as a way to relate to, again, her very religious mother. I loved the voice of that story. I thought it was obviously like so different from what I'd been spending years working on with Homegoing. I kind of set it aside, returned to Homegoing, and forgot all about it until I started writing Transcendent Kingdom, and then I remembered that woman, that voice, that situation, and I thought, okay, maybe this is a good place to start this book from.
I love that so much. And I understand about the absorption of like his story too, but it's also like I also found myself slowing down as I was reading to settle into the music of certain sentences. There's this contrast that's delivered between beauty and the difficulty of the content, and your ability in a sentence to hold both things simultaneously as poems do. And one line or one sentence I wrote down was, she would always miss the gray rock of her mother's heart. So we've got alliteration, we've got this Hopkins-esque spondaic rhythm and brevity. So I'm curious about your approach to sentence composition, what my friend poet Suya and Juliet Lee calls sentence work, and how you think about sentence work versus scene work.
Oh, that's a great question. I write really very slowly. It doesn't always feel that way. Like this book took me 2 or 3 years to write, which is relatively quickly, I suppose. But my writing day is really, I'm not the kind of writer who's writing thousands of pages and then cutting, or writing hundreds of pages and then cutting. I'm the kind of writer who's like really laboring over a sentence and a paragraph. And with Homegoing, I had a 400 words a day goal. I didn't have any kind of goal for Transcendent Kingdom writing days, but I'm really interested in the kind of musicality of a sentence. I read all of my work aloud, and I start all of my writing days by reading what I had written the day before, again aloud, because I want to make sure I'm getting the sentences right. I want to make sure they sound like me and they sound like what I want them to sound like. And it's not, I have a friend, she's a novelist named Chia Lin, and she talks about her writing, her fiction writing. She has a novel called The Unpassing, and she says that she writes a single sentence a day, and like that's her work, that's her work day. I'm not on that level. But I do think that sentence work is really important, and however long it takes to get that sentence right, I want to take that time.
That's very much a poet move, like the
Yeah.
reading aloud and then taking your time. I feel like so often we're, you know, perceived to be these writing machines, and you have to write every single day, and we're frantically tossing out pages and drafts, but it's really, it's different for everybody, and it's different from book to book.
Yeah.
I know that all of my books I've had a different writing practice. So I'm happy to hear you talk about how the um, process for Transcendent Kingdom differed from Homegoing. Was there like an emotional difference as well? Like, how did you feel during the process of writing? How did you feel through that process? Because I know it like takes a lot out of you, and we don't talk about that nearly enough.
That's so true. This is something that I've been trying to talk about more because again, like I don't think that I hear it from writers a lot, but after Homegoing, I felt really kind of bereft. I had spent 7 years working on this novel that really did feel like it felt like this culmination of all of the things that I had been thinking about, obsessing over from ages like 19 to 25. Like it encapsulated my adolescence in a way that I felt really close to it. And so to have it come out and have to kind of put it aside and start thinking about new ideas and new characters and new questions, like it just felt like too much. So I was a bit sad after I finished that book, and I thought, how could I ever start anything else? And it took me a while. And I think what helped was the fact that Transcendent Kingdom is so different. Like from a craft perspective, there are so many different components to this book. Homegoing was really sprawling, but it was also incredibly tight structurally. It was almost mathematical. I needed 14 POV characters to get from 1750 Gold Coast to roughly present day America. It was told in the third person. And at the beginning of the novel, it's a really pulled back, omniscient third person, and then it gets closer and closer. And it covered many different time periods and a lot of history. By contrast, Transcendent Kingdom is in the first person. It covers no more than 30 years. It's set in just 2 places. And so it kind of required such different work from me, such different like ways of thinking about fiction writing, that I think it allowed me to kind of set aside the work that I had done for Homegoing, and to not compare the 2 books even for myself. Like they felt like apples and oranges.
I agree, and the difference between the reading experiences is similar. Like I
Mm,
found myself needing to take a break after
mm,
each chapter to just let it sit with me when I was reading Homegoing. And
yeah.
I actually bought it a couple of years ago as an audiobook. And I was just like, well, god damn. I don't know if I can grieve like this right now because I gotta finish my PhD. So I didn't get through it. Like I got through like maybe the first few chapters. So I was happy to be able to return to it, but it took me so much longer to read it than Transcendent Kingdom.
Mm,
But I also like really value this sort of intimate epic quality of Transcendent Kingdom, whereas we had this external worldly type epic world building in Homegoing. So I
yeah.
value both, and I think we also don't get to talk about that, like this interior world building, as especially Black authors.
Mm.
Like it's always, oh, we want to talk about the most sensational thing, addiction or slavery, but like I would love to hear how you think about world building in the epic.
Mm. Yeah, Transcendent Kingdom is still quite a maximalist book. It has just about it's faith and science and immigration and race and family and mother-daughter relationships and addiction and It's still quite ambitious, but it takes the scale down to the intimate. And when I was thinking about how I wanted this book to be seen, how I wanted it to be read, I just kept thinking, I want it to read the way a life feels. It's not like we walk through life just with one identity at a time, one situation at a time. We're informed by every single part of ourselves, um, all of our history, all of the people that we're around. And I wanted this book to have that kind of a feel. Gifty isn't just one thing, she's a million things, because everyone around her is a million things and they've impacted her life. There's a moment in this novel where, returning to that question of the spiritual wound, which comes up about midway in the novel. Gifty overhears these two women talking about her brother's addiction very unkindly, and quite racist, in quite racist language. And she calls that moment a spiritual wound that takes her years to find and address. And she also says, I'm not a historian or a social scientist or a psychiatrist. I can look at the brain of a depressed animal, but I don't always think about the reasons that animal became depressed. And I think of this book as a way to bring in all of the other things that she says she can't see. So we're looking at the history component, we're looking at the social science component, we're looking at the kind of therapeutic component, and we're also getting the neuroscience. So it's a book that's like trying to kind of break down all of the ways that we experience our world, we experience our lives. And I think ultimately the reason that it works is because we understand this when we interact with each other one-on-one. Like we see this in each other, that we're not just one thing at a time, that we're everything at once.
That's right. And one of the things I really love is the depiction of mothers as complex and how they're not like typical mothers. And even when they're not comforting, when you least expect it, they do something that a mother, like you would expect a mother to do, which upends your assumption that they're just cruel, right? So I wonder how you think about the depiction of mothers, like how you approach, like did you have like a mission in mind as to how you wanted to show mothers? Did you have an example? Because I'm thinking about Toni Morrison, all the complicated mothers in her books. So yeah, long question. I'll be quiet now.
I love a complicated mother in fiction. It's one of my favorite subject matters to read about, like thorny mother-daughter relationships, and just kind of complicated womanhood. Complicated Black womanhood is something that I'm really interested in seeing on the page and in writing. And Gifty's mother, I think, is a character that I really, really loved writing, because she is, that first chapter ends with Gifty saying she was wild inside. And for a woman who, for the most part, spends this novel in bed, like her storyline in the present day is really quite still. She's suffering from depression, and she's become so severely depressed that she often doesn't leave the bedroom. And so how to depict her as this wild woman, how to depict her fierceness, her cruelty, her tenderness, that became the real task. And I think for so much of this novel, she is really kind of emotionally unavailable to Gifty. She works these really long hours when Gifty's a child. So she's not really around in the ways that Gifty might want. But in addition to that, I think she's carrying something herself that the novel never really lets you see, that because Gifty never is able to see it, because her mother is so reticent that Gifty doesn't know what it is. But when Gifty's in Ghana meeting her aunt, who is exuberant and very affectionate and loving, Gifty recognizes that this is like the kind of woman that her mother could have been, and maybe deserved to be. And we are left wondering, what was the turn? Like, what happened to this woman that kept her from experiencing that joy, sharing that joy of life with her kids? And so I find her to be really fascinating mostly for all of the things that she doesn't say that we don't know. And the way that I show that or try to get to that is to show Gifty in her searching, in her clear desire to want to know so much more about her mother, in her efforts to take care of her mother, to draw her mother out, to find a language that her mother will understand and speak. I think that's the way that I kind of build out this character who is incredibly complex, and fearsome, and to me very interesting.
Oh, for sure, for sure. And it's like we don't tend to think of mothers as adventurous or
Mm,
on adventure, but that seems to me what Gifty's mother wanted, by coming to America in the first place and sort of refusing to give up on it. She was interested in having a life that was not typical. She was
mm,
curious, it seemed to me. And the world could not accommodate her exuberance. And
mm,
so she folded it in, and to me, I've witnessed that, you know and I appreciate that we have this, even though she's unnamed. It's almost like she's represented, or she's representative of women in the archive that
mm,
we cannot find, right? Or whose stories we cannot know because they were not able to tell their stories for whatever reason, or their stories were
mm,
withheld from us. So
yeah.
I definitely appreciate that about this book. It looks like we're getting to the point where, it's time to answer y'all's questions. So make sure you put it in the Q&A box. Let me see if there's one like that I can't do without, and then I'll check it out. Um, let's see. Oh, I really wanted to know about friendship. I love that friendship was such a big part of both novels. And I love that friendship was your way back into writing after the weight of homegoing. So I wondered if you want to talk about friendship in your work.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think that yeah, that's a good point. I actually hadn't thought about the fact that friendship was my way back into writing after homegoing. And I think that the friendships that Gifty experiences really kind of move her along as she's trying to heal from her own traumas. And those poor friends, especially some of the early ones, like they end up doing a lot more emotional labor probably than they anticipated. But you see how much Gifty gets out of those relationships, how much she sorely needs those relationships, having come from a family that was so chaotic and that wasn't, again, as emotionally available to her as she needed. Friendships started to kind of fill in the gaps of the things that she wasn't getting elsewhere. And that's something that's been really important in my own life. Like I had a therapist who would always say, like, where else can you get this thing that you want, that you need? Like if you're not getting it from this person, where else can you get it? And I loved thinking about that because I think that friendship is often where you get that thing that you're not getting. And so I wanted to explore those kinds of relationships, particularly with Anne in Gifty's college years. Like you see her finally getting something that she sorely needs, and she's scared of it. Like she doesn't let herself have it because she's not used to it. She's not used to being seen in those ways and being touched in those ways. And you wish that if she'd met Anne a little later, maybe things would have gone a little differently. But I do think that friendships are really, really important in helping us, again, like fill those spaces, fill those gaps that we aren't getting in other aspects of our lives.
Absolutely. And the notion that we're like solitary beings creating lives on our own is such, a fallacy.
Hmm.
And I love too, like, of course I can't like not think about Toni Morrison because I've been teaching her a lot, but friendship, especially between women, is so integral to character development. So I love seeing that take place in both of the books. And I'm thinking about Kofi in particular in Homegoing.
Hmm.
um, so let's see what kind of questions we have in here. We have a secondary English teacher in a school with students who hail from all over the world, and she wants to know if you have any pearls of wisdom to share with young writers, reluctant and otherwise.
Oh, um, the thing that I always say to young writers, which feels sometimes like a lazy answer, but it feels the truest, is just to read as much as possible. Like, read as widely as possible. Read things that you feel like you don't quite understand why it works or how it's working. It's okay to not understand it yet. I feel like so often I'm metabolizing like ways of thinking, ways of creating fiction because of all of the stuff that I've read. And so it's still the most important aspect of my writing life is to read as much as possible and as widely as possible, and to stay open to like the vein, whatever it is that allows you to receive. And then the other thing that I would say is to start when you're comfortable to start sharing your work with your peers, with people who have your back and will give you supportive feedback, because I think that's also how you start to get better, is to see how other people are responding to your work as readers.
Let me co-sign in the strongest possible terms the reading part,
Mm.
and also sharing with folks that you trust. And I guess what I would add is not being afraid to mess up.
Mm.
It doesn't have to be perfect when you're just starting. When I was in a workshop with Cornelius Eady many years ago, and he was like, "It's just a draft, right?" You know, in his Cornelius voice, "It's just a draft.
Mhm.
So just write the thing, and then you can revise it later. But don't be afraid to make mistakes." Is my advice.
Yeah,
Let's
absolutely.
see what else we have here. The title. What kingdom is transcended, or how did you arrive at this title?
Mm. Yeah, so the title comes from a moment early on in the novel where Gifty is talking about a high school biology teacher who said that Homo sapiens are the only animal who believe that they have transcended their kingdom. So basically, that humans are the only animals who think that they aren't animals, that they are beyond animal. And I think that that is pretty much like the central idea of what Gifty's work is about. Like, she's thinking about asking all of these really difficult and transcendent questions about why we're here, what it means to be alive, how we make sense of life that in which senseless things happen. And it felt like it also like tied into the faith component too, like that faith itself was like another way that Gifty approached these questions about what it meant to be here, what it meant to be human. And yeah, so that's where the title comes from.
I'm going to butt in with another one of my questions because your answer made me think about it. I wondered about the relationship between faith and care. There
Mm,
is definitely a thread, you know, with the mothers and with like self-care and care shown to one another. And it
mm,
seems like we're taught that religion is supposed to be a comfort, but it isn't always necessarily. So I wondered how you thought
mm.
about how to depict care when it comes to both faith and relationships.
Yeah, care was one of the central topics of this book, I think. You know, Gifty's mother is herself a caretaker by profession. She's a home health aide. She's in the houses of the elderly, many times kind of staying with them until they pass away. And she uses this skill. We see her using these same skills with her family members as they suffer, as they're sick. This seems to be the point where she really kind of steps into her maternal role, where we get to see her kind of displaying that same kind of emotion and affection that we might expect of mothers otherwise. So when it's her turn, when she herself is ailing, Gifty gets to kind of return that favor, to step into that role herself. We see her, you know, making sure her mother has something to eat. We see her bathing her mother. All of these moments that are incredibly tender, and full of care, which is, I think, how these two women show their love. But as far as care in the faith community, I think one of the things that I was really grappling with is the fact again, that they are so isolated within their own faith community that they aren't always receiving the same kind of attentiveness and sensitivity that they might have received if they had gone to a Black church where people kind of welcomed them with open arms. The arms that they are welcomed with at their church are not particularly open. And so we don't see some of the typical signs of caretaking, of attentiveness that we might see. There's a moment later on in the novel where Gifty is wondering where her church was when Nana was passing away. Where were they? And it's a question about the kind of the gaps that people experience in their religious faith. And I think it's very specific. Like, I think that the church can often step in and be that place of care and attentiveness. But I think for this family in particular, given this circumstance of being so deeply isolated for a number of reasons, they don't get that from their church.
I love that you're pointing out the absence of care to show where the care should have been.
Yeah.
And I feel like Gifty too is like watching other people to see, you know, even beyond that, like are they just gonna talk about the problems of the world, or are they actually gonna do something? Like, what are the words for if they're not gonna, you know, have requisite action? So one of my other questions was, I'm sorry, y'all, I know y'all got questions. One of my other questions is, what is the value of words right now when action is so very vital in this particular moment in time?
Oh, that's a hard question, Khadijah. That's something that I've been thinking about so much these days because obviously, like you, I make my life out of words and I think that they are important. And I think they're particularly important now in helping us kind of clarify what we're seeing and helping us tell the truth about what's happening, so that it can't be twisted, it can't be revised. I think that that's hugely important. But at the same time, I recognize that the work that is being done, particularly through fiction, is a kind of slow work. Like, I don't expect that people are going to read my books and then, you know, just like abandon all of their privileges and, you know, work for the good of humanity necessarily. Maybe a couple people have, and that's wonderful. But I think that the words have to be ones that drive a particular kind of action. Like, it's not enough to like buy the books and then not change any aspect of your life. So the books are like the place where you start to interrogate how you yourself are implicated in the things that you are reading about. And once you do that, that's where the action comes in, or should come in. And if you're able to read something that moves you really, really deeply and makes you see the world differently, but then nothing changes about your daily life, your daily circumstance, then I think that a failure has occurred, that something is not quite connecting. And you should do the work of interrogating what that thing is and why. And often it's about not being ready or willing to give up some of your comfort.
Oh, that's so correct. Do you know Morgan Parker's book, Other People's Comfort Keeps Me Up at Night?
I don't know that book, but that title is.
Yes, yes, yes. I think about it a lot. And I love what you said about that. And I want to just sort of rephrase it a little bit and try to lead into one of the questions from the audience. When you arrive at the clarity and precision of language and thought that reading invites you to take part in, and then you then go out into the world with this newfound way of thinking, your actions are going to be different if you have brought it into yourself, you know, in full faith. So, and I don't necessarily feel like that faith is a spiritual type of thing, but I do wonder, and an attendee is asking how spirituality informs your work, if it does.
I think it definitely does. I grew up in very similar circumstances to Gifty, religion-wise. Like, I grew up Pentecostal in a predominantly white church, and I was incredibly faithful as a child. deeply devout, a true believer. And I had these moments of reckoning with a church that was politically, like ideologically, so different from my family, and from the things that I was starting to believe for myself, that I felt like I couldn't really reconcile that particular aspect of my faith with my own political beliefs. Like that started to feel irreconcilable for me, and so I turned away. But as I've found, and I think as Gifty explores in this book, like it's not like all of that time that I spent in that place just goes away. You know, it's not like that foundation just disappears. Like there's still so much of that spirituality, that faith inside of me, and how it manifests, I think sometimes is hard for me to articulate, hard for me to think about, but I see it. I was trying to describe to a friend, Ayana, like the way that I think about writing, which is perhaps not the way that other people think of it, but it had to do with like all of these years of being taught that if you just kind of wait and keep doing the right thing, something will come, like something will happen. And I feel that deeply as I'm writing, that I'm like just trying to stay open, trying to be a vessel, like all of that language of the spirituality that I had with when I was a child still holds true. I've placed it elsewhere. I use it for other purposes.
I definitely feel similarly. I grew up as a Muslim, and I left when I was 18 because that was when, like, once you turn 18, my dad said you can do whatever you want. And so I didn't want to be somebody's second or third wife. So I was like, I'm out.
Yeah.
So, but there's still something really holy to me about the Quran and hearing verses, and I still like, if I do pray, that is the language that I pray in. So I definitely felt that through Gifty. There's like a certain kind of inquiry that faith instills in you that I think she reflects. Let me go back to one of y'all questions before we go. Cool. Can you talk? Oh, this is a great one. Could you speak more about addressing the act or process of narrating the historical fabric of it all? In your work, the tapestry of history plays with the process of unsilencing pasts and excavating wounds.
Yeah, I think more explicitly in Homegoing, which was such a like an undertaking research wise, I think that how I think about this is that my work is I want my work to be in conversation with the historical record. Like I want my work to, you mentioned the gaps in the archive earlier. I'm always thinking about that when I'm writing. I'm thinking about the fact that there are so many people who did not have the opportunity to tell their stories, to write their stories in the ways that it happened, and had to have the colonizer, the slaveholder, tell their stories for them, their stories, and knew that it wasn't theirs. There's a really great writer who I love, a writer academic, Sadia Hartman, who works in this way that she calls critical fabulation, which is about like, again, like kind of resurrecting, giving voice to these gaps, like trying to figure out a way to make up for the gap, knowing that you can't really, that you'll never be able to fully do that. But I think that's where my love lies, like that's where my heart lies, and like being able to say, okay, we've got this one version of the story, I'm going to read that, I'm going to read all of the historical texts that I can. For Homegoing, I was reading a lot of stuff that was written by, you know, colonizers, by people who came in and said this is what happened, and now my job is to see around what they're saying so that I can say, maybe this is not what happened, maybe this is what really happened. And if this woman or man or child had been able to write their own story, this is what it might have looked like. So I think of my work as being in conversation with those larger works.
Absolutely, it is. And I feel like we're answering like all these like really deep, intense questions. So I wonder if you want to get into something a little lighter. to close, but I do want to ask first. I want to make sure that I ask if there's anything in all of your events that you have wanted to talk about that you haven't had a chance to talk about, if you wish someone had asked you.
Oh, that's a good question. I can't think of anything. No, I think they've all been so different that I think they have been covering like different aspects of the book in a nice way.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So, what are you reading? What are you working on? And also, what has been your most important discovery about yourself as a writer, especially after completing, book 2, or something that maybe something that you understand more deeply about the world after writing book 2?
Mm. So right now I'm reading The Woman in the Dunes by Kobo Abe. Came out many years ago, but I wanted to read something that was like a little speculative, kind of mythical, and this book was recommended to me. So that's what I'm reading. But I just finished Memorial Drive, Natasha Trethewey's memoir, and I read it last Saturday and just like wept on the couch all day. It's beautiful, as is everything she writes. And before that, I read Luster by Raven Leilani, which I thought was really excellent as well. And then I'm too superstitious to say exactly what I'm working on, but I will say that I've been thinking about some things, and I'm at that place in the phase of writing where like I'm waiting to see which of the things is going to bubble up and stay. And then in terms of what I have learned, I think one thing that I have learned is just to kind of trust myself, trust the process. I had so much anxiety after homegoing, after like years of working on this book, but also years of like thinking about myself as a certain kind of person in a certain kind of way. To have to go from that like private, quiet self to the very public world of publishing was really, really hard for me. And it made me think for some time, it made me wonder for some time if I was going to be able to find my way back to writing and if I was going to love it as much. And after Transcendent Kingdom, like I feel so much like joy and also like relief and ease, and now I feel like even more certain than ever before that like again that if I just like stay open that whatever it is will come, it will come through me, and that makes me feel really, really good.
I think that's perfect. I think that's a perfect note to end on. And I will echo that feeling, after writing so many books. It's just like, it'll come.
Yeah.
And you can release that thing that tells you you can't reproduce the success of a different book. The success is going to look different, and it's going to mean something different for you with each book. So having the faith in yourself and confidence in yourself and enough care for yourself to continue to write books, because that's what we do as writers, is write books, and feel free in that impulse to create. That's the most important thing, I think. Thank you so much for being with us. This was fantastic conversation.
This was great. This was great. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for the questions. This was lovely. And thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure.